Welcome. I'm Samantha Johnston. I'm the Executive Director and Curator here at Colorado Photographic Art Center. If it's your first time here, welcome. We are a nonprofit photographic art space. We have exhibition programming throughout the year, just like this. We also do education programming throughout the year, and we have a darkroom and digital lab space for rent. So we do lots of different programming, and we hope you'll come back for more. Thank you for joining us. This is the second panel as part of our exhibition, Western Cowboy Reloaded, and this show is up until June 20th, so please take a look tonight or come back or tell your friends. And this exhibition brings together 6 Colorado photographers to look beyond myth and nostalgia, revealing the layered histories, cultures, and lived realities that continue to shape the American West. And I want to just give a huge thank you to our exhibition sponsors, Melissa Cheong from Bonfi Stanton Foundation, a trustee there, Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, the Morgan Family Legacy Foundation, and the W.C. and E.J. Thornton Foundation. So thank you. And I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Juan Fuentes. I was born in a little town in Chihuahua, Mexico, and then living here in Denver for about pretty much my whole life. And been photographing, I don't like to use the word professionally, but professionally for about 12 years now. And yeah, I'm excited to be here and be able to talk a little bit about these works and how they interact in this space. And yeah, very excited to hear about you guys' process.
Hey everyone, my name is Amanda Lopez. I live here in Denver. I moved here in 2023, but I'm originally from Sacramento, and I am a editorial and commercial photographer. I've been making work about as long as Juan has, and I also have my own personal art practice, and that's kind of what keeps me excited and interested in photography, and happy to be here with you guys.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Constance Jaeggi. I'm originally from Switzerland, but have lived in the U.S. for the last 15 years, in Texas most of that time, and just recently moved to Denver. And I have a background in kind of ranching and the horse industry. I have spent the last 15 years immersed in rodeo. And so a lot of my work revolves around horses and my relationship with horses. And yeah, I'm excited to be here with you guys and share this space.
So I just have a few kind of general questions, and we can see who wants to take them, and then some specific questions about the work. The American West has long been narrated through a particular lens, often white, male, and Anglo. And how does your work kind of reclaim or expand on that story?
Well, yeah, I think that for this particular body of work, and probably through the rest of my work too, I think the narrative that we're used to seeing in pop culture is kind of this idea of the Lone Ranger cowboy, acting alone against the bandits, let's say, so good against bad. So there's this kind of stereotype that we're used to seeing in Western films. And when I was working on this project, I was really interested in countering that narrative with, the story of, first of all, the sport of escaramuza is a team sport. So you've got these women working together towards a goal. And I think that this narrative of the Lone Ranger cowboy has sort of left out a lot of the diversity that the history of the American West actually has. And so for me, it was about bringing that back in And then I think my perspective as a woman as well obviously has an input on that. I don't know if I really answered.
No, you did. Yeah.
Yeah,
I echo like what you say. My work is the work back there. I moved to Colorado in 2022. When I came here, I started to see in the winter like poster or billboards for the National Western Stock Show, and that really piqued my interest because I'd never been to a rodeo before. And when I looked at the schedule, I saw like the Mexican rodeo extravaganza, and I was like, "Ooh, I got to go to that." I'm Mexican, and my family has like a history of like their own cowboy Western history. And so it just kind of piqued my interest to go to the rodeo. But the reason it piqued my interest is because I wasn't interested in, excuse me, documenting like a more expansive view of like the American West. Like I wanted to include the Mexican cowboy because really the Mexican cowboy without them, I don't think it's like without talking and sharing that work, like you don't get like a really expansive view. And so that's what I wanted to do with those photos.
I think for me, this work is just an extension of my kind of larger body of work that I've worked on since I started, which is just um, it's part of that reclaiming. It's part of that fighting for visibility, but it connects not just the American West or this idea of the cowboy, but just the idea of brown bodies existing in this area, and then the fact that this is indigenous land to brown folks for, in my body of work, I've done that through documenting the community here in Denver, both indigenous, Chicano, and this work is not necessarily like a project that I kind of decided to kind of hyper focus on rodeo or the cowboy. It was just an extension of that. It's brown bodies that have been doing this for a long time, are here, and don't necessarily had the same visibility that you had when it comes to like the big rodeo here and things like that. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
That's perfect. Thank you. And I want you just to talk a little bit about your work, but I think, Constance, if you could share a little bit more about the Escaramuza and the work you did with the poets, and then also I'd love, Amanda, for you to talk a little bit too. I know that your work kind of came out of being photographed for NPR, but then we've expanded on what we've selected here. So great.
Yeah. So this body of work is not kind of it's quite different from the work I'd done previously. It was initially commissioned by the Cowgirl Museum in Fort Worth in Texas. They were wanting to do kind of a larger exhibition on the Escaramuza tradition. And I had been interested in photographing cowgirls. I was interested in the idea of what is a cowgirl, and they were aware of that. So they asked me to photograph this tradition. And initially I was, thrilled. I didn't know much about Escaramuza, and as I really started digging into the story and researching, I realized that there was a lot to the story. I realized that I wanted to focus on U.S.-based Escaramuzas rather than travel to Mexico, where the sport is originally from. I was interested in the idea of these women participating in the sport here, being first, second, third, fourth generation Americans, and kind of, doing the sport as a way of expressing their connection to their cultural heritage. And these ideas came through the interviews that I did with the teens all across the country. And then I would say one of the kind of important things when I embarked on this project was the realization that I'm very much an outsider to that sport and to the culture. And so how do I make sure that I honor the stories that these women are telling me? And I'm not a documentary photographer, so I I I liked the idea of trying to create work that went a little beyond the idea of documentary, and poetry felt like a nice way to bring these women's voices back into the work rather than just using direct quotes. So I collaborated with two Mexican American poets, Angelina Saenz and Irene Lara Silva, and they wrote this amazing collection based on the interviews that I did with the writers. And I think those poems really bring out their voices and their individual stories, and a lot of kind of these underlying themes that I was really interested in.
Sam, you want me to talk about like the commission for so like I said, when I moved to Denver, I was interested in getting to know my new city that I live in better. And when I learned about the National Western Stock Show, and then part of the scheduling that they had the Mexican Rodeo Extravaganza, like I said, I was really excited. But I knew I needed to get access to like document those photos. I had an instinct that I probably couldn't just bring my camera and go backstage and take pictures of people. So I was thinking, okay, how can I make this happen? And I reached out to a contact that I had at NPR, and they have this photo essay section called The Picture Show. And I thought, I think this work could be perfect for that section. So I reached out to them to see if they could help me get access, and they did, which I was really excited about. And so the photos that I made were for NPR, and it took them like 2 years to publish, maybe 3. It took a little while to get everything aligned, but they finally published it. And one thing kind of interesting that happened after I took those pictures is I called my mom. I was so excited. I'd never been to a rodeo before. I was like, oh my God, Mom, I went to this Mexican rodeo. Have you ever been to a rodeo? It's so great. You should go. She's like, yeah. She's like, your uncle. I would go to his ranch every weekend. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, your great uncle Merced had a ranch outside of Sacramento, and I would go every weekend to the rodeo, and the whole family would be there. And I hadn't known that history about my family. And so then I thought, well, let me call my dad, because my dad probably has a story to share with me too. And I said, Dad, have you been to the rodeo? I just went to the rodeo and it was amazing. And he said, yeah. He said, your uncles in Michoacan also had a ranch, and I would go there growing up. And so my family had this history of going to charrerías that I didn't know about. And I probably, to be honest with you, probably wouldn't have found out had I not kind of followed my curiosity about like the Mexican rodeo and talked to my family about it. So that was kind of like a fun little thing that came out of it. And it makes sense. I think something maybe instinctually in me, like, just was interested in it because it's in my, my family backdrop. So that was just something kind of cool that came out of like the whole project. And now it's here, which I'm so excited to be a part of the show and, share space with these guys.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that for me, the community that ties between specifically throughout the show, but also specifically your 3 bodies of work. I also want, if you could touch a little bit on, I think for me, that difference of like photographing at, the Colorado State Fair, right, versus kind of National Western Stock Show. And I know there's maybe nuance and undertones to that, but I thought it was interesting because they were not in the same place. I love also the different way that obviously you and Amanda have different styles and how different the work is photographed, but Juan's is around the corner of the large vinyl with the images on top. And as we worked on that layout, I think that really drew the work together, is having that huge. But if you could just speak a little bit more to that photographing there, how you kind of got drawn to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't be the expert to be able to tell more of like the nuance of like what takes place in different regions or different um what do you call it? Just like, yeah, different events between the charreria. I know a bit. I mean, kind of like Amanda, like my family ties, has connections as well. But I think maybe in our generation, we just didn't necessarily, unless you grew up in the rancho, like I have some cousins that did and that they pursued it. But for us, I guess living in the city in the United States, like it just these traditions maybe get lost there. But what's amazing with what attracted me to the state fair was, me and my family were already going, especially on the last day of the state fair. Is called Fiesta Days. They usually do the Mexican rodeo with the huge concert at the end of it. And it started with my family wanting to go for the concert. They have like the OGs playing there all the time. So for my dad and for my mom, it was like the kind of nostalgic thing to go and see those bands that they grew up. And I grew up as well because of them listening to. So it was, it's a family affair. We're going out there. So actually, the first couple years we went down, I didn't take my camera or anything. It was more so just to kind of experience that with my family. Um, but that was probably the most exposure I had to the Mexican rodeo, and then realizing that some of the folks that were participating, there's a couple of people that I knew. An old student of mine, 1 year was participating. So there was these connections, and through that, I was able to gain some access too. And so, I can't remember what year was the first year, but I was like, you know what, I'm going to take my camera this year, and I'm gonna document it, but not with this end goal of like, oh, I want to make a project out of this, or maybe I can publish this. It was more so kind of like I said, the continuation of like the work that I was doing here in Denver already, and it's just about just that kind of radical act, just documenting and showing ourselves through our own lens. Um, and so it slowly started with just kind of me, just documenting the whole day, just like the state fair, everything around it, and then later in the evening the rodeo starts. And I didn't have that much access at the beginning, so I was kind of documenting as like a spectator through, there's like an image there at the back wall where I'm like still behind the gate. And then I think the following year, a good friend of mine was participating. And so he could kind of brought me into the back. And so I was starting to gain a little bit more access, and it was just fun. But I was still there kind of not in project mode. I was there kind of in like party mode and like celebrating and hanging out with the homies. So, yes, these are some of the nicer photos. There's some pretty blurry photos there towards the end of the night that probably didn't make the wall, but yeah, that's.
I think that's when the best photos come, when there's like no pressure. At least for me, I think like my personal work, like I love to do personal work because there's no pressure. Like there's no deadline, there's no one telling me you got to do something. And so like, I don't know, like you approaching it from a personal perspective. And so I think that's like, at least for me, like anytime it's just personal, it's like it's fun and you have freedom, and I think you get the best pictures that way.
I agree. I also think, that's why I had wanted you to talk a little bit, as you did, you shared about the NPR and the picture show, because I think that's what I love, is seeing that kind of the personal style of each of you as photographers showing through in the bodies of work, that's not necessarily a personal body of work you're working on. However, your style is like showing through in the images. So,
and that was so yeah, that was for a client, but also I was really excited about it. So it was like, it felt like personal. It was like, okay, like what can I do? Like, and it was a little bit outside of my realm. Like you said, Constance, I'm not typically a documentarian photographer. I don't do a lot of photojournalism, but it was like a cool challenge for me to not, because I'm pretty collaborative when I work, because I like to make portraits and I like to make sure people are comfortable, and I like to have time to create something, great with the person I'm working with. But for something like photojournalism, you don't have that luxury. And so it was like a cool challenge, but also, like when I could backstage at the Mexican rodeo, I was like, okay, can I have it just 1 second? It's gonna take like the girls together. I saw them. I was like, can I take a portrait? And, it wasn't like the typical session that I would do. It was like 30 seconds and they were gone. But that felt good to me to just be able to make the kind of work that I like to do, in addition to like documenting what was happening.
Absolutely. And Constance, could you speak a little bit more about, I think that's what I love in your work too, is that they're not in the other two bodies, that's the performance, but you're not capturing the performance of the escort. You're capturing them kind of at practice, but in their full garb. And maybe speak a little bit too about that difference between Escomuza in Mexico versus the United States. I thought when we talked on a different panel, I thought that was really fascinating to learn a little bit more about that I didn't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something you said, that I also had a similar experience where this was commissioned and it wasn't the type of work that I'd done in the past. I'd actually never really done portraiture before of people. I'd photographed horses and made portraits of horses a lot, and so I had this I had a certain aesthetic for that, and when I started working on this, it was also like a really cool challenge in a way. I was like, this is an incredible story, and I felt close to it in some ways and distant from it in other ways, because it is not my culture. But on the other hand, I am a woman, with a connection to horses, and so we had all of these points of connection, and yeah, it was a fun chat. It was also one of my first projects in color, so I had all these fun challenges, and I feel like I grew a lot throughout the process. And then to what you were saying about the differences between Chareria in Mexico and in the U.S., that was one of the things that kind of because this was kind of a foreign culture to me and a foreign tradition, and I didn't know much about it. I felt like I really needed to do a lot of research prior to starting. So maybe less intuitive, like in a sense, a lot of my work in the past has been very intuitive, and this was different. It started kind of very research heavy. And when I was reading up on Chareria in Mexico and Chareria in the US, one of the things that came up a lot was that in Mexico, it is, for the most part, the sport of the wealthy. There's a lot of the teams there seem to have a lot of resources, not everywhere, of course, but in general. And then the sport in the U.S. is practiced mostly by immigrants and descendants of immigrants. And one of the stories I heard a lot from the women that I met and interviewed was this idea that their grandparents or parents had come over and had started from scratch. They had no money and had to work their way up to being able to afford horses and being able to afford this sport, because it is really expensive. And that was one of the reasons why I chose to focus on US-based escaramuzas, because they had this extra challenge that I felt like, their story needed to be shared more.
Another question I had is kind of, how do you feel that these images work to preserve cultural memory? I have to give some challenging questions.
I'll give it a shot. I have a lot of respect for the tradition that I got to discover through the making of this work. And I got the sense through the women that I met that the connection to their heritage was extremely important. They have a lot of respect for the tradition and for maintaining the values and maintaining the way that tradition is practiced. For example, when it comes to attire, like there's a lot of strict rules around attire, and they have a tremendous amount of respect for the dress and the way they treat it and the way they think of it when they wear it. One of the things several women told me is, when we wear our Adevita dress, we represent Mexico. And so throughout the making of the project, I felt like I was witnessing cultural preservation. And I think the photographs hopefully help reinforce that. But in reality, I think it's the tradition itself that's preserving the culture, and the respect that these women have for what they do, and um, the work that they put into keeping it alive.
The other, I want to leave time for questions too, because we have a nice, great audience. There's a long, layered history of romanticizing the West, and we see exhibitions that do that. I thought a lot about that as I put this show together. I really wanted to try to be inclusive in a different way, and include a lot of different imagery, and think about, the West, not just as through the escaramuza and the Mexican rodeo, but then even thinking Rob's work and Jack in particular, who are, working with these rangers, working on farms. These are things that still exist. And so are there things that you feel that are being left out in the documentation as people who have not focused on documenting the West per se, but just have done different projects at different times?
I would say just in general, like the dominant narrative, like that we touched on earlier, is like a white male kind of Anglo lens. And so, like for me, I think what gets out of that conversation, is the, the Mexican cultural contributions. Black cowboys get left out of the conversation. Indigenous cowboys get left out of the conversation. So for me, it's like, it's not the complete story that we see of the American West. Like in the dominant narratives, like we're leaving out like these rich histories. And so, that's what I think is missing.
I don't know if I could add too much to that, but I was just thinking right now, kind of some thoughts coming to me, but I think we have to push forward to like break that even just that saying of the American West. I think it's pretty tired. I think these traditions are upheld throughout the world, and I feel like when we say the American West, automatically gives it a white perspective, and it makes things for the white audience, white American audience, and I feel like we have to kind of fight against that. And so, these are just kind of thoughts coming to me, but I think I'm pretty tired of hearing about the American West.
That's completely fair. I wanted to leave time for questions amongst our panelists because I know they haven't spent a lot of time together, but I also, if there's questions in the room, please raise your hand so I can pass a mic just so we can record it.
I just had one more thought on your last question. As someone who's spent the last 15 years like heavily immersed in North American rodeo, I call it now rodeo, I was really interested to learn about Cheridia, and to learn that Cheridia is a precursor to North American rodeo, and that, it's actually the other way around. I think coming from the rodeo world, I figured this was a derivative, but it's actually the other way around. And so, I like the idea of like rectifying and honoring kind of the history.
That's great. Thank you. Questions?
I have a very limited understanding of the Cowboys based on probably movies and limited perception, but I understand the Cowboy way to be more reserved and maybe more have a little pushback as far as getting in front of a lens. So my question would be, in your experience as you've been documenting and photographing the cowboy, the cowgirl, the Cheridias, have you noticed that resistance, or is there a sense of pride when they're asked, can I document this? just in your personal experience, what has that been like?
I'm happy to start. It was actually people were very, very forthcoming when it came to reaching out to teams. Um, I think in the escaramuza world, there's a ton of pride, and I experienced a lot of excitement around being able to share that with a larger audience. And so I didn't encounter any issues with it, which was great.
I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this question because my project was so photojournalism based, and so I was kind of making photos as I go. But the thought that came up for me was like that stereotype. I think people are so different. I think we can't like assign like one like attribute to like what someone might be like, you know. So I don't know. Like in my limited time making this work, I didn't come up with that experience, but yeah.
Yeah, I think in my experience with this particular kind of event, I think it's a little bit more open. I think because it is performance, it is, in this space of entertainment. I think they're dressed up, they're even going all out to make sure that they're in their best for that day. And so, of course, I think, especially in this generation, I feel like welcoming the camera is a little easier. But I've also experienced something a little different, photographing, kind of in that same realm. Some ranchers and cowboys out in Bennett, Colorado, a few years back when I was doing a project out there. And that was more so with way more limited access, me kind of going into this community that I didn't really know. And I photographed a few ranches out there, but for the most part, it was just like, during the week when like the people that were like maintaining the ranches that were like, in the middle of like just a long day of work, and um, doing that tough work that comes with being a cowboy. And maybe, at that time they just didn't want to be photographed, this sweaty environment, so there was a little bit more pushback then. But yeah, I think what Amanda was saying, it's just like, it's hard to, I think with everything is hard, and it just kind of comes down to individuals. But I think in performance, I think in Amanda's and I's kind of scenarios, I think there was a little bit more access. And then I think with Constance, I think with you going in, I think this is meaning my perception, but you going in and building that rapport and that relationship, I think opens up a lot. And I just can't see why somebody who dresses like this wouldn't want to be choreographed.
Hi, this question is for Constance. I like your work a lot. Can you tell me a little bit more about how do you pronounce it? Escaramuza?
Escaramuza.
I'm sorry, I just don't know what that is. Can you give me a background?
Sure. So to start at the beginning, Curator, which people refer to as Mexican rodeo, has this long history, and historically women were always left out of it. In Mexican culture, it was unthinkable for a long time for women to ride alongside men. So it wasn't until the 1950s that women in Mexico started really requesting a place in Curator, and essentially this tradition was born. So Escaramuza is a performance that is a part of the wider Curator, the wider rodeo, and it's technically the only part of Curator where women are even allowed to participate. So there's still a lot of gender segregation within Curator. And again, for context, like a charreada, a rodeo might last 3 hours, and the portion dedicated to the women is like 3 minutes. So it gives you a little bit of perspective. And then as far as like what they do, they're essentially they're creating performances to music at high speed, and they're kind of making these patterns and crisscrossing at high speed. And the inspiration behind that is the women who fought in the Mexican Revolution between 1910 and 1920. And there's a lot of legend, I think, around the soldaderas, the women who fought in the Mexican Revolution. And one of the legends is that they would send women into battle prior to the men to kick up dust and distract the opposing side and make them believe that there were more soldiers than there really were. And that's where kind of, the myth of the soldadera is present in the escaramuza tradition. So escaramuza translates to skirmish, kicking up dust. And yeah, so it's got this lovely origin story. And yeah, I hope that answers your question.
They're also riding side saddle and in those costumes, which I think is just amazingly impressive and fantastic. So, other question? You are.
Thanks. How much of the work is about the rodeo, and how much is it about the people who perform, and how much of it is about the intersection?
My particular series is like both, I would say. It's about the people, but also like what's happening is so impressive. And so when making a photo, it's like that definitely had to be part of like, what I was documenting. So for me, it's like an intersection. Plus, like I said, I love portraiture. And so I really tried to find those moments where I could document and make photos of the people outside of like the activity of rodeo, but I would say for me it's both.
Yeah, I think for me it's kind of in the same realm. Although in my work, when I do projects with a little bit more intention and I'm thinking about who I'm photographing, I think I dive a little deeper. I'm like, I just recently done a project where I was engaging with the community for almost a year before I even took a single picture, as opposed to here where it's a little bit more candid. And to me, I think what I was excited about creating this work was more so taking back my practice to when I first started, when I was still kind of more, quote unquote, kind of more like street photographer approach, where things were just kind of capturing the moment, and it wasn't necessarily about the specific person or the individual. It was more about capturing a moment, and I think this is a similar approach that I'm taking like 10 years later into something that I deeply connect with, in the sense of that it connects with my culture and some of my family. But I'm still in that intersection where I'm not dedicating, I'm not thinking too much about the individual and what the story is, but I'm also not trying to be dismiss that either. So I don't know, it's kind of it that way.
I would say the same thing. I think the two are inseparable, the performance and the sport itself, and then the people who make up that sport. And I did choose to focus more on the individual stories because I felt like that was where kind of the layers were. And given where this project was supposed to be living for a short period of time, it was for this exhibition at the Cowgirl Museum, it was relevant to really dig into the individual stories and experiences. And I think the poetry did that too.
Any other questions? Great. I want to thank you all. I love getting to sit and hear you talk about your work. I also want to mention that Constance has a beautiful book that we have for sale here, and she is here, so she can sign copies if you'd like. Just let us know. Dessa can help you, or I can help you. Thank you all for joining us. Please stay. Please take a look at the work if you haven't had a chance. Please, the artists are here if you want to ask them more questions, and we appreciate you joining us today.